1859, members of the Fred and Adolph Solomon family landed up in Denver. They were traders coming into the city via New Mexico. They were the first of many, so to speak, wandering Jews attracted by the opportunity, the hopes and dreams of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. Before long, there was a large enough Jewish community in Denver where there are services for the high holy days. However, efforts to form a congregation at that time faded. Efforts to build a synagogue failed. At the most, a Hebrew cemetery landed up emerging in the 1860s. It occupied the land about where Botanic Gardens built its parking garage east of Botanic Gardens between approximately 9th and 11th Avenues from York to Josephine Street, and occasionally they still find bones haunting the area. Perhaps a reason that Botanic Gardens is able to grow such beautiful flowers. However, it was not until the 1870s that efforts to have a permanent Jewish communal organization, congregation, came to fruition. And what happens next is going to be the subject of today's talk.
Welcome, everybody. We are thrilled to have so many of you join us today. It's really exciting to know that our numbers are growing and that our guest speaker continues to draw a crowd. So today, I would just briefly like to introduce our Kavod on the Road staff. Christy Ziegler is our Director of Marketing, and many of you know Gabriel Sanders, who will be our technical assistance today to make sure that the program goes smoothly and the PowerPoint presentation, you can see all that. So we will have everybody pretty much muted except for Phil and Gabriel and myself. If you want to see Phil in full view, if for those of you who are not sure how to do that, take your mouse and hover in the upper right corner and it will say speaker view, and you can click on that to see the face of the main speaker. And so what we'd like you to do is hold your questions to the end. You can certainly type them in the chat. If we have time to get to them, we will. So for now, we'll use the chat box for questions, and I will certainly navigate that for Phil at the end. And also, as well, we will review the upcoming programs for Kavod on the Road this month. So without further ado, it's time to introduce our presenter. Phil Goodstein is our very own Denver native expert historian. Phil's knowledge has always intrigued and enlightened us and all who has attended his lectures and even his tours. He has written numerous books and articles. As many of you know, Phil has been a regular on our Kavod on the Road circuit, and as you can see, he draws a crowd. It is my pleasure to introduce Phil Goodstein and the Lost Synagogues of Denver.
By the early 1870s, Denver is booming. During that decade, the city grows from 4,759 people to 36,000 people. And as Denver is booming during this decade, so is the Jewish community. Nobody is more a leader of Jewish Denver at this time than Louis Anfenger. And already in 1871, 1872, he is pondering that the city needs a permanent congregation. When his wife delivers his son in 1872-73, he definitely sees that the congregation is necessary for a bris for the occasion. And out of all of this lands up emerging Temple EMANUEL, Congregation EMANUEL in 1874, and soon a building campaign is underway. And before long, Congregation Emmanuel builds a very simple house of worship over at 19th and Curtis Streets. This is just to the northeast of the Central Business District, the Curtis Park neighborhood, which is then filled with numerous Jews, including the Anfenger family, living in a most distinguished Victorian manner just by Curtis Park proper, over near about 30th Avenue and Champa Streets. Well, before long, the growing Congregation Emmanuel is out of space at its building at 19th and Curtis Streets. And the upshot of all of this is that it hires Willoughby Edbrook in the early 1880s to design it a $20,000 basilica at the east corner of 24th and Curtis Streets as its new distinguished home. Willoughby Edbrook at this time is a leading Chicago architect who had come to Denver to help design the Tabor block at 16th and Larimer Streets, the Tabor Opera House at 16th and Curtis Streets. He brings his younger brother Frank with him, and soon Frank is in charge of the building over at 24th and Curtis Streets. And here's just a few contemporary images of the still surviving 24th and Curtis Temple Emmanuel. Well, Temple Emmanuel doesn't actually spend that much time at the 24th and Curtis Street building, because after a devastating economic collapse in 1893, when the city starts growing again, it's growing on the hill east of the Capitol, Capitol Hill. And by this time, leading Christian denominations are building magnificent houses of worship near the Capitol, and Temple Emmanuel wants to do the same. Amidst all of this, the building at 24th and Curtis lands up bursting into flames on November 5th, 1897, and that's all the congregation needs, where it decides that it's going to move to a new home off at the southwest corner of 16th Avenue and Pearl Street here. And that's actually the 1924 wing of the building. Let's go to the next shot that will show the original Temple Emmanuel at 16th and Pearl Street. The congregation lands up occupying the building in 1898, and before long, it starts outgrowing it. By 1924, it's at capacity, and it debates whether it should actually occupy the old Hebrew cemetery land over by what becomes Botanic Gardens, which at this time is then the abandoned Catholic Calvary Cemetery, or it should expand, double in size, the building at 16th and Pearl Streets. And as the next picture shows, or the last picture shows, not that, let's go back a couple of that. There, back one more of that. Go ahead one. There, that's the one. They built sort of a new south wing to the building, and what immediately catches the eye is that rather than the very, very ornate cupola tower of sort of a Muslim tower emulating the golden age of Spain, there's a much, much more sedate tower at the wing on the left of the building. Well, by the 1950s, the story with Temple Emmanuel is the same. A new drift of population sees the Jewish community increasingly moving to what some have mockingly called Hanukkah Heights, or Hilltop, along the way out of that, and soon there is a push to relocate Temple Emmanuel to Hilltop, and this leads to the opening of a new home for Temple Emmanuel over near First Avenue and Grape Street in 1957. Soon something called the First Southern Baptist Church of Denver occupies the 16th and Pearl Street Temple Emmanuel. It stays there for about 20 years, and then something of a holy roller congregation, Loving Way, takes possession of the 16th and Pearl Street Temple Emmanuel. And this is a group that's out there preaching to save evil, wicked Colfax. Its members carry big Bibles. Jesus loves you. Jesus is going to save you. And so everybody knows it. The preachers of the congregation go up to the top of the towers at Temple Emmanuel at midnight, at 1 a.m., at 2 a.m. to try to evangelize the surrounding neighborhood. And most of the neighbors see Loving Way as a total nuisance. Loving Way finds its rent hiked beyond what it can pay in the early 1980s. By 1984, there is a threat of demolishing the building. After quite a campaign, the city gets possession of it as something called the Temple Event Center. It has never been quite successful, never quite succeeded in its aspirations, but it has remained standing. Well, meanwhile, going back to the old Temple Emmanuel at 24th and Curtis Streets, when Temple Emmanuel lands up moving out of that building in 1897, it sells the structure to BMH. Beth HaMidrash HaGadol is emerging as the modern, traditional, Orthodox, conservative congregation of East Denver. Early on, there is a division between Reform Jews are in East Denver, Russian Orthodox Jews are in West Denver. And from the beginning, a lot of the West Denver Jews are envious of the East Denver Jews, and they want to move to East Denver as soon as they can do so. In addition to that, there's a number of Jewish peddlers, business figures, promoters, professionals of East European origins already living in East Denver. And that's the situation in 1890 when Henry Plonsky, a cobbler that is running a Larimer Street shoe store with great aspirations, announces the formation of the BMH, the Great House of Worship, or the Great House of Study of that. And soon the congregation is rapidly growing, and before long, there is starting to be a rivalry between the BMH and Temple Emmanuel. They agree that they're co-religionists, but they also have those rivalries between the Orthodox and the Reform. Basically, Temple Emmanuel sells the 24th and Curtis Street buildings when it's a burned-out ruin to BMH. BMH, of course, claims Temple Emmanuel is charging too much. Temple Emmanuel claims that BMH is not paying enough. Well, anyway, the BMH is growing in the early 20th century. And as the first generation East European Jews are starting to be joined by a few second generation East European Jews, once more the population is shifting to Capitol Hill. Among the leaders, promoters of the BMH is a guy named Isidore Rudy. He starts out as a tailor, makes an immense fortune in the clothing business, and he arranges for BMH to get the land off at the southeast corner of 16th Avenue and Gaylord Street about 1919. Soon, a member of the congregation, an architect, Judd, who also is working for the federal government, drafts the plans for the building, which leads the BMH to land up going and consecrating its new temple in 1921, complete with a sanctuary that can seat about 1,000, 1,500. Let's see the sanctuary picture of that itself there. And for the next generation, the BMH flourishes on the premises for years. Somebody named Rabbi Charles Hillel Kavar dominates the congregation from about 1903 till his retirement in 1953. But by the 1960s, the BMH once more is not quite clear of what its future is. Its members, supporters are increasingly going and relocating to Hilltop. And so about 1965, the BMH lands up getting a hold of land directly to the east of George Washington High School at South Monaco Street at about Virginia Avenue, where it slowly starts building its new congregation there, moving out about 1969. The 16th Avenue and your Gaylord building also included an annex, the Denver Hebrew School, or the United Hebrew Center. Next picture, let's see the Hebrew School, that's the stained glass window. But anyway, the picture right here, let's go to the Hebrew School of that here, is sort of illustrative of the evolution of the BMH. Already in the mid-1960s, BMH abandons the building as the Hebrew School for children growing up on the east side. It lands up leasing the structure to Denver Public Schools, which lands up turning it into something called the Metropolitan Youth Educational Center, basically a place for adolescents that have dropped out, have been suspended, have had problems with the law. Well, anyway, after the BMH moves over by George Washington High School, the old building at 16th and Gaylord becomes for a few years the American Indian Center as a gathering social welfare facility. Efforts are made for a while to have a nightclub in there. In fact, the promoters of the place decide that it's going to be officially a go-go. And towards this end, they incorporated as SYNGOGUE was the name they were using for various real estate titles, and details of that lands up failing. Soon the place is abandoned. It's filled with junk, early computers. The roof is caving in. Pigeons are flocking through the place. Efforts to turn it into condominiums land up failing. And amidst all of this, around 2000, there's a rather problematic real estate deal that lands up occurring with an old Safeway a couple of blocks east of the BMH at 16th Avenue and Josephine Street. And by this time, the 16th and Josephine Safeway was something called Church in the City, which was something of a Christian evangelical outreach effort of that. An associate of then Mayor John Hickenlooper gets a hold of the Church in the City Safeway, and in exchange for that, he arranges for Church in the City to get a hold of the old BMH at 16th and Gaylord. And towards this end, Church in the City, that also has a branch where there's sort of a Jews for Jesus congregation, officially called Beth Abraham on that itself, just does this magnificent job of going and renovating the building. And let's go back one to the stained glass of that. And part of the decor of the BMH when it moved into 16th and Gaylord was some magnificent stained glass of Bible scenes. When the BMH relocated over by George Washington High School It moved the stained glass with them. And in fact, part of the decor near the social hall of the contemporary BMH are the stained glass windows. And Church in the City came in and virtually reduplicated them. In some cases, added new stained glass. Let's go back another one to see the sanctuary. Well, this is the contemporary sanctuary of the Church in the City, and they even have the 4-letter name of God above the ark. What's very interesting, missing from the place where they used to keep the Torahs, of that they never put an eternal light on in there. Well, meanwhile, we need to get back to 24th and Curtis Streets. And in particular, there's a debate going on in the BMH when it decides to move to 16th and Gaylord, whether that's a good idea. And about 20% of the congregation did not think that that was a good idea. And those that did not want to move and like the location at 24th and Curtis Streets go and land up forming a splinter congregation, Beth Joseph. The house of Joseph, in this case, is Joseph Mandel. Joseph Mandel is the father-in-law of Isidore Rudy, who not only helped finance the new BMH building on Gaylord Street, but then he gives to Beth Joseph the money for them to help put down the down payment on the 24th and Curtis Street Temple EMANUEL. Beth Joseph suffers badly at its Curtis Street location. By the 1930s, it's doing well to even keep it open, to pay for the heat, the light, taxes, insurance. It does not have a permanent library. It maybe has 20, 30 total families. By 1941, Beth Joseph is on the verge of giving up. Then World War II breaks out, and it figures that surviving is a great achievement, a great accomplishment. After the war, as Denver east of Colorado Boulevard, especially to the south of Colfax and Colorado Boulevard, starts growing, Beth Joseph agrees that it's going to be the congregation of New East Denver. And towards this end, it abandons the Curtis Street building, and it rather has services at various rental halls in East Denver until about 1952. It lands up getting a hold of the land between 8th and 9th Avenues and Holly and Ivanhoe Streets, where it slowly starts building its new home, including a 1,600-seat sanctuary that is dedicated in 1958. And by this time, Beth Joseph under Rabbi Daniel Goldberger seems to be the most dynamic congregation, constantly growing every week, 1, 2, 3 bar mitzvahs, bas mitzvahs itself on that there. And this goes on for another generation. By the 1990s, however, both the BMH and Beth Joseph are somewhat stagnant. They're starting to lose members. Old members die. They fail to get young blood on that. Long forgotten animosities, rivalries between the two groups land up more or less dissipating, that leads to the merger of BMH with Beth Joseph as BMH-BJ, the Denver Synagogue, in 1996. Soon a Christian denomination has the 8th Avenue and Holly Street building. Before long, a sect claiming to be Jewish, claiming to be Christian, claiming to be distinctively Korean, claiming to be an American product, lands up taking possession of the 8th Avenue Beth Joseph. Soon they're clashing with the neighborhood. The building is in terrible shape with peeling paint. The New Savior congregation that sometimes has the Sabbath on Saturday, sometimes has the Sabbath on Sunday, sometimes has it on both days, celebrates Jewish holidays, celebrates Christian holidays, celebrates Korean holidays, moved out a year or two ago. So if anybody's looking for an empty synagogue with great potential, here's another opportunity for you. Meanwhile, we need to get back to the 24th Street and Curtis Street, Temple EMANUEL. When Temple EMANUEL gets rid of that building when Beth Joseph moves out, Golden Bell, a printing company, moves in. And for years, Golden Bell uses it as part of its printing operations as a warehouse. In the 1980s, there's efforts made to try to transform the Curtis Street Temple EMANUEL into a rock concert hall. Nothing works on that, but even so, as a sign that the building on Curtis Street is definitely worth saving, is already in 1978. Its owners see that it lands up being listed on the National Register of Historic Places. About 5 years ago, as part of a general renovation of the Curtis Park neighborhood, a new owner gained possession of the Curtis Street Temple EMANUEL. He's very aware of its history. He's been using it as an event space, as art galleries, as something that ideally is going and tying Denver's first surviving synagogue building with the 21st century. But that's just the beginning of the lost synagogues of Denver. That only goes and follows the east side along the way. Of that, then there is the west side. And the building that most embodies the original West Side Jewish congregation, and let's move on to something called Sheriff Israel. Well, there's another one here. I'm glad you showed the picture right here. This is something called Oheb Zedek at 2222 Marion Street. In 1911, there was a split in BMH. And those that do not like Rabbi Kavod, especially the cantor of the congregation, Jacob Schrater, split away. Oheb Zedek is Hebrew for those that love justice. Soon the congregation lands up building a fairly substantial hall at 22nd and Marion, but then it runs out of money halfway through the effort, and the roof is never properly designed. Before long, the roof collapses, repairs are constant. By the 1930s, those that love justice realize they cannot afford the building, and they land up merging back into the BMH in 1935, and the building is sold to something called Cleves Campbell Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and it still is a branch of what is today the African American Methodist Church, Campbell denomination. And it wasn't until about the turn of the century that they replaced the Star of David with the rose window near the top of the structure. But that's a detour as we want to go on and get over to Sheriff Israel on the Auraria campus near the corner of 10th and Lawrence Streets. And this is actually the oldest surviving house of worship in Denver, dating from 1877. It was built by something called Emmanuel Episcopal, EMANUEL Episcopal was the second Episcopalian congregation in Denver. It was sort of the working class Episcopalian congregation, as opposed to St. John's in the Wilderness, the high class Episcopalian congregation. Well, before long, the Episcopalians moved out to about 12th Avenue and Lepon Street. In the 1890s, a group of Black Episcopalians moved in that are the forerunners of something called Holy Redeemer Episcopal near 26th and Williams. For a while, a Anglo-Episcopal congregation is in there. And then in 1903, Sheriff Israel occupies the place, the messenger of Israel. And by this time, the Auraria neighborhood, which is where Denver began, is filled with numerous small houses, flour mills, canning operations, lumber yards, car workshops, body shops itself. And there is quite a large number of Jewish merchants living in the area, and they come together at Sheriff Israel. And from the beginning, Sheriff Israel is never quite clear. Is it really a house of worship, or is it a social club? And in the 1930s, it tends especially to be a social club, because at this time, a lot of the people are unemployed. They know that there is one place they can go every day and sit around in a warm setting, and that is Sheriff Israel. However, there's no indoor plumbing at Sheriff Israel, so if they have to engage in certain body functions, they have to leave the building for an outhouse behind the structure itself. Well, after World War II, virtually all of the Jewish residential settlement of Auraria lands up disappearing. Once more, members are drifting to southeast Denver along the way out of that there. And amidst all of that, by the 1950s, the congregation basically gives up the ghost. About 1952, 1953 or so of that. And among those that take responsibility for the building is Mo Katz. He's a neighborhood businessman that has his factory nearby. He constantly is visiting the structure. If there's a broken window, he fixes it. He shovels the snow, so he keeps it in decent shape. At one time, he offers the building to the Allied Jewish Federation as a quarters, a community center. That doesn't work out. It lands up becoming artist galleries in the 1960s. When the Auraria Higher Education Center decides that Old Auraria is going to be the quarters of Metropolitan State College, Community College of Denver, and University of Colorado, Denver, it saves the old building, calling it the EMANUEL Gallery. And in 1968, the Denver Landmark Preservation Commission declares that the old Sheriff Israel is landmark #1, the first officially designated landmark of Denver. Of that, there still is a little Hebrew lettering over the main doorway of the building. Otherwise, there's not much of anything recalling that as among the synagogues that are no more within the community. For the most part, however, when we talk about West Side Jews, we're really thinking about West Colfax Jews. And let's go on to the next shot here of something called the Labor Lyceum over at West CONEJOS Place, which is a half street between Colfax and 16th Avenue and Julian Street. And the Labor Lyceum goes up about the time of World War I. At this time, there is a strong Jewish workers' movement in Denver. And the Jewish workers' movement realizes that the Orthodox congregations do not represent them. The Reformed congregations do not represent them. Rather, they are in the spirit of solidarity. Most are self-proclaimed socialists that want to change the world. A lot of them have no use for Hebrew schools, and as opposed to that, they decide what the city needs is a Yiddish school where the children of East European immigrants can learn Yiddish rather than Hebrew along the way. And amidst all of this, Jewish carpenters join with Jewish masons, with Jewish glazers, with Jewish roofers, so forth on that in putting up the Labor Lyceum. And this is to be a social hall, a meeting place for years whenever there needs to be a left-wing meeting, be it that of the socialists, the communists, a general protest meeting against injustice. It is being held at the Labor Lyceum. By the 1930s, disputes between communists, socialists, what the future of the country is, has torn apart the Labor Lyceum. About 1935, the Labor Lyceum relocates into something called the Charles Spivak Institute, which is over along the east side of the 1400 block of Lowell Boulevard, and Zara Abraham lands up taking possession of the old Labor Lyceum. Zara Abraham is the second oldest synagogue in Denver after Temple Emmanuel. It lands up emerging about 1885. And at this time, the Cotopaxi colony is a total disaster along the upper Arkansas River near the Royal Gorge. One of these days, a Kavod on the Road program is going to talk all about Cotopaxi. And a lot of the survivors of Cotopaxi, who are overwhelmingly Hasidim, land up coming to Denver, needing a congregation of their own. They land up forming Zara Abraham, the Children of Abraham. The original congregation, the house of worship, is right near West Colfax Avenue and the Platte River. Later, it moves up the hill to about Colfax and Federal Boulevard. It immediately has problems when it moves into the Labor Lyceum. And part of the secular overtone of the Labor Lyceum is that the Labor Lyceum designed its auditorium so everybody faced to the west rather than the east. And among the first things that Zara Abraham has to do in the building is to sort of reverse that so the worshipers all face to the east. Meanwhile, Zara Abraham goes down into the basement and lands up putting a mikvah in there of that. Well, by the 1950s, the pattern among West Colfax Jews is sort of like that of East Colfax Jews. They want to go elsewhere. And in the case of many West Colfax Jews, this means going off towards the city line near Sheridan Boulevard. And among the groups that are part and parcel of this exodus is Zara Abraham, that lands up occupying its current home over near West Colfax and Xavier Street about 1962, 1958, 1962 or so. In terms of it, the old Labor Lyceum later is a child care center. For a while, it's the Silent Athletic Club of Denver, a location where deaf individuals have a meeting, socializing spot. For a while, it's the home and studios of a non-Jew Dave Rosenberg, a very, very skilled photographer. In recent years, it's been totally remodeled into a wild party house. So once COVID breaks and you want to go to a wild party some night with the appropriate Jewish overtones, there's the place for you along the way. A block to the west of the Labor Lyceum, and let's go to the next slide or two of that itself, is a place called Yad Achas, the one hand, the one people, at the southwest corner of King Street and West CONEJOS place. And this was the Romanian shoal of Denver. And part of the settlement of West Colfax is Jews from throughout Eastern Europe are descending on the community, and often they have their old world divisions as part and parcel of what goes on. They are established about 1903. The building itself only goes up about 1923. And for years, Yad Achas had the reputation of being the bar mitzvah shoal. And in particular, a few blocks away from it, over near about 20th and Lowell Boulevard, was something called the Jewish Sheltering Home, or the National Home for Jewish Children. That was everything from a Jewish orphanage to a location of Jews from the East that have come to Denver to try to recover from TB. And it was pushing the religious education of the children growing up at the sheltering home. And at age 13, it hauled the boys over to the building so they would be appropriately bar mitzvah. The congregation goes defunct in the 1960s. Since then, it has been a Christian congregation. Then another of the congregations that didn't survive, let's keep going, a couple more slides up, stop here, is the old Ostrover shoal. And that sure doesn't look like much of a synagogue, does it? Located over at the northwest corner of Lowell Boulevard and West 14th Avenue. The Ostrovers were from a region of Poland that landed up coming to Denver in the early 20th century, and soon the Ostrovers are clashing with a lot of the other Orthodox Jews on West Colfax. The Ostrovers tend to have Lithuanian or Sephardic pronunciations. Like it's the question, is my name Goodstein or is it Goodstein? That they would say Stein for the occasion of that. And for a while, there was an effort to have a unity between the Ostrovers and the Litvaks, Jews from Lithuania. And that never worked out because East European provincial divisions were not easily healed within the community. Within a few years, the Litvaks break away to have a place called Zara Israel, and for years it had its congregation over at Colfax and Grove. It later relocates to West 14th Avenue in Perry, where it goes defunct about 2000. Well, meanwhile, the Ostrovers are pushed out of their location near Colfax, 14th and Federal Boulevard by Urban Renewal about 1959, when they build a rather simple blonde brick congregation at 14th and Lowell Boulevard. They last there about a generation. By the early 1970s, they land up going defunct, and when they sell the building, they land up donating their assets to BETH Israel Hospital. Let's go on to BETH Israel here on that. And BETH Israel Hospital opens up in 1923 off at the southwest corner of Lowell Boulevard and 17th Avenue as a Jewish-sponsored hospital. It also has a senior citizens home as part of it. Let's go on. The senior citizens home is a little off to the left over there. The senior citizens home is still standing on the campus. Well, meanwhile, after World War II, Beth Israel undertakes a massive expansion, both as a hospital and a seniors home, and it needs a new chapel as part of the affair, whereupon the Ostrovers donate their assets to create something called Ostrover Beth Jacob as the congregation, the synagogue, as part of Beth Israel. Well, by the 1990s, Beth Israel decides that the Old West Side is not the place for it to be. The seniors' home lands up relocating to far southeast Denver that becomes Shalom Park. Before long, an order of Catholic nuns is running Beth Israel, including the seniors' home, including the kosher kitchen in the place, until they open Shalom Park. Today, a rehabilitation hospital is in the old Beth Israel location. About 2006, 2007, the whole old Beth Israel seniors home, second Ostrover congregation came down. Meanwhile, for a while, the Ostrover synagogue at 14th and Lowell was occupied by a Vietnamese Catholic church. Since about 2000, it's been the home of La Luz de la Mundo, a Spanish language Protestant revivalist congregation. So again, another of the lost synagogues of town. Well, meanwhile, the key lost synagogue as we go forward on that itself is the Hebrew Educational Alliance building at the southeast corner of West Colfax Avenue and Meade Street. And by the early 1920s, the West Colfax community is rather divided between the Jews living east of Federal Boulevard and those living west of Federal Boulevard. And those that have moved west of Federal Boulevard are lamenting that there is no social center for Jewish children, especially adolescents are hanging out in pool rooms and other evil activities are going on. And a couple of groups that try to redress this are the Beth David Sisterhood and the Denver Hebrew Alliance. About 1926, they merge their efforts and decide what is needed is a new conservative synagogue for West Colfax, and they slowly land up constructing the new home of their location that opens in 1932 as the Hebrew Educational Alliance. And the alliance is constantly growing over the next generation as a lot of the small congregations that had 10, 15, 20 loyal worshipers are folding, dying off in the mid-20th century. Their children, their members are joining the alliance. They give the alliance their Torahs. They give the alliance their books along the way. And the upshot is that by the early 1950s, the alliance has completely, hopelessly outgrown its building at Colfax and Meade. In 1953, it lands up moving into a new home over at West CONEJOS Place between Stewart and Tennyson Streets of that. And here's a picture of the second alliance building. Well, the alliance keeps growing there, and then it starts stagnating. And in the 1960s, and especially the 1970s, there is this massive exodus of middle-class conservative Jews from West Colfax to East Denver to Southeast Denver. And typical is the situation about 1994, 1995. At that time, the Alliance has about 1,000 families. Of them, only 50 of the families live within walking distance of the Tennyson Street building of that, and that leads the Alliance in 1994 to resolve on a new home just off to the north of Thomas Jefferson High School, very close to Hampton and Interstate 25. Well, after the Alliance abandons the building on West CONEJOS Place, it ends up being occupied by its current tenant, Yeshivas Torres Chaim. And let's go back a couple, 3 shots itself and back forward. And this building right here, which is located off at the northeast corner of West 14th Avenue and Quitman Street, goes up about 1941, 1942 as a planned yeshiva. Plans for a Denver yeshiva, a Jewish high school, college, go back probably to the first decade of the 20th century. At one time, there was something called the Hooker Street Shul at West CONEJOS Avenue and Hooker Street that was pushing it. In the 1930s, it puts its assets into the Quitman Street building that leads to the unveiling of the cornerstone here, actually in 1941 of that. But by this time, World War II is the situation. Helping the Jews of Denver, of Europe, is the key concern of this. So this is just another neighborhood synagogue, the Quitman Street Shul, the Yeshiva Shul. And it's not until the 1960s that Yeshivas Torres Chaim actually finally lands up being organized. Of that, there's an old Denver yeshiva, which was sort of the neighborhood Hebrew school at West 14th Avenue and Federal Boulevard at one time, which was independent, incidentally, of the yeshiva synagogue. This got torn down about 1959, 1960 in the name of urban renewal of that. But anyway, the Yeshivas Torres Chaim had dormitories near West Colfax Avenue and Perry Street of that, and they get possession of the old Hebrew Educational Alliance. And amidst all these activities, they are completely remodeled the building. They demolish the old sanctuary for new dormitories, other such facilities. Itself on that. Briefly, since we're running out of time, talk about just 2 other lost synagogues itself on that. This is the old Zara Israel building, a fairly quiet congregation of the Litvaks, and there was always an interesting division. In many ways, the BMH was originally a Litvak congregation, but those were East Side Jews, a lot of whom become conservative or simply traditional, versus Zara Israel was the Orthodox congregation of that. And when it lands up folding in 2000 or so, it lands up being transformed into basically a residence. So today, if you want holy living, here's another opportunity for you. Finally, we go to Beth Jacob, a girls' high school, an Orthodox girls' high school dating from the late 1960s. And originally, this was a location called the Samet Shul. Ben Samet is a very successful, very Orthodox member of the West Jewish congregation of that. He has a commanding home right across the street from Sloan's Lake at about West 17th Avenue and Zenobia. And he always is a very persnickety worshiper. And to make sure that there will be at least one congregation in town that will hold services exactly the way he wants them, will pronounce controversial Hebrew Aramaic names precisely the way he believes they should be pronounced, he lands up sponsoring his own synagogue off at the southwest corner of 14th Avenue and Zenobia. Officially, it was the Baruch ben Isaac David Synagogue, or shul, named for his father. He helps Beth Jacob get off the ground, arranges for the congregation, the girls' school, to occupy his old synagogue. He dies about 1970. Beth Jacob, in turn, keeps growing. About 1985, it tears down the old Samet Shul for the contemporary building that is pictured there. But anyway, with that said, I see we're running out of time. What I would usually do if this was a live event is I would hold up and hope to see it here, my latest book, something called The Denver Busing Wars, the history of school busing in Denver, the upheavals tearing apart the city in the 1970s, 1980s, a period that sees the emergence of many Jewish day schools, an increasing exodus of Jews from Denver for the suburbs itself. On that itself there, and I try to sell books and hand out flyers to my tours. Alas, the curse of COVID is upon us. And now I see that Ava has two questions. Why were there the West and East Side Jews so separate? Just a physical separation? No, it wasn't more than that. Again, it was social and religious background. The East Side Jews tended to be of German Reform background. For the most part, the German Jews that arrive in town have a business orientation from the beginning. They are middle class and they want to fit in with modern American society. They dismiss their Eastern cousins from Eastern Europe, especially the Tsarist Empire, as people that have been caught up in the Middle Ages and have had no progress for 200, 300, 500 years, and they look down on them as a bunch of uncouth barbarians. The West Side Jews, in turn, tend to be growing up in the faith, are very observant, very literal. Many are saying we have to go and keep our faith, to keep our identity itself. And a lot of them are seeing the Reform Jews as virtually apostates itself on that. And a lot of these tensions still are within the community, with issues such as, why is the Jewish Community Center closed on Saturdays? How much of the city's Jewish population is inconvenienced by that itself? But for the most part, in the name of unity, issues like that are rarely mentioned of that here. So don't see any other big questions or whatever of that itself, but somebody did want to say, I thought Jewish cemeteries were not allowed in Denver city limit. Originally, when the Hebrew cemetery starts accepting bodies at 11th Avenue and York Josephine Street in the mid-1960s, that's beyond Denver. As Denver annexes the land, it already exists there. Efforts are made to move the bodies from the Hebrew cemetery beginning in 1896 but were never complete. In fact, when they were excavating the foundations for the parking garage of Botanic Gardens about 15 years ago, they found bones, they found old coffins that were well preserved, hidden away from the days of the location of that. And for that matter, there's still many bodies of the Catholics from what is Botanic Gardens, upwards of 2,000 bodies in Cheeseman Park of what was once the Denver City Cemetery, the general burial ground within the community.